I like to be forward-leaning.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Well, we'll know next time, and maybe.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you all to today's meeting, which is another in our ongoing Non-Proliferation Forum series that we co-sponsor with our institutional partner, the Los Alamos National Laboratory. We're extremely grateful for the support that the lab has provided to this series. We'd like to thank the lab director, Michael Anastasio, and also Paul White of the Nuclear Security Office, who's here today. We welcome those who are here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but also those at Los Alamos and elsewhere who are watching today's proceedings on the webcast. It's a special pleasure to welcome Thomas D'Agostino to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Let me turn the floor over to my series co-chair, Joe Pilot, who will introduce our distinguished speaker and also tee up today's issue.
Thank you, Rob. Let me offer a welcome from the Los Alamos National Laboratory as well as from myself. The role of nuclear weapons in deterrence during the Cold War was a matter of bipartisan consensus, although there were at times bitter debates over specific systems, numbers, and related issues. Today, in a very different security environment, there is no clear consensus on nuclear weapons, on such issues as their roles, the right approach to sustaining them, and the requirements for credibly deterring some of the dominant threats of the day, the so-called rogue states as well as terrorists. As the existing stockpile ages, along with the broader nuclear weapons complex, addressing these issues becomes more urgent, and the need for debating them openly is, I think, imperative. Given that, we're very fortunate today to have with us Thomas P. D'Agostino, the Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs at the National Nuclear Security Administration, and the nominee of the President to become the administrator. In his current position, he directs the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which has enjoyed a considerable level of bipartisan support now for over a decade and has been, I think, deemed by everyone to be a great success, technically as well as beyond. And in addition, in previous incarnations, Mr. D'Agostino has held positions in the National Nuclear Security Administration, in the Navy, and has distinguished himself in all of those areas. Without further ado.
okay. Thanks very much. I appreciate the introduction. And probably best to start off with the fact I am the President's nominee for administrator, but I'm not the administrator now. And so I'll be focusing a lot of my discussion on what I'll call the weapons program piece of the topic at hand, and particularly our look at moving forward on looking at a different strategy. Is it time to reevaluate a different strategy? So I do appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's good to be in a room full of people that share my interest in exchanging views and having a good dialogue on national security issues. I hope to keep my talk to about 20 minutes or so, leave time for some questions. I'm sure there will be a few questions about our plans, and I encourage as many questions as possible as we can fit in. So I'm basically here today to talk to you about the U.S. nuclear weapons program and our proposal, essentially, to replace our aging Cold War stockpile with one that's more secure, that's safer, easier to maintain, and that can be one that can be maintained and achieved without underground testing. But first, I need to give you a little bit of background. During the Cold War, the nuclear weapons programs were undertaken in reaction to a clear and present danger to the nation's survival. They involved large, multi-billion-dollar development and production activities for both weapons delivery systems as well as the warheads themselves. There was sustained and intense attention and scrutiny to these programs by senior government officials. The uniformed services had strong and prestigious career paths for officers involved in nuclear weapons research and development, production, planning, operations, and there was sustained widespread interest and support within Congress's leadership and rank and file. More generally, there was reasonably robust bipartisan consensus that nuclear weapons, in large part, were essential to our nation's security. In regard to warhead development and production, the National Nuclear Security Administration and its predecessor agencies at the Department of Energy were replacing the stockpile on average about once on a 20-year cycle. There were always several major warhead development system efforts underway at each of our laboratories at any given point in time. The stockpile was very large. It was diverse, with many different types of weapons. There was a large warhead production complex producing up to 2,000 warheads per year. On average, we were conducting over 20 nuclear tests per year, both to develop new warheads and to assure the safety and the reliability of the existing stockpile. As we near the close of the second decade since the Cold War's end, not one of those features that I've just described carries over to today. We stopped new warhead production in 1991. We stopped underground testing in 1992. Our Cold War design and build strategy has evolved to one of preserve and maintain. We've not designed and developed a new warhead in 20 years. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. nuclear forces have been rightly de-emphasized and no longer command the same attention from senior officials or from Congress. The bipartisan consensus that we had about nuclear forces during the Cold War has essentially evaporated. And as a result, some key capabilities the nation has asked us to maintain are in jeopardy. Today, the threats to the United States and its allies are more diffuse and uncertain than they were in the past. That's clear. The end of the Cold War was a welcome event, but it's had enormous implications for our nuclear weapons program and the infrastructure of the nuclear weapons complex itself. In the years following the end of the Cold War, budgets for the nuclear weapons program were in free fall. Funding was simply not available to sustain both the research and development and the production capabilities. And since I said earlier we weren't producing anything, the production capabilities suffered. And there's the strategic decision that was made at that time in the early 90s was essentially to strengthen and sustain the scientific and technical activities in order to ensure future capability to certify the stockpile. And that was the key, continued annual assessment and certification of the stockpile. When the U.S. stopped nuclear testing in 1992, it sought to replace our ability to test with a stockpile stewardship program that emphasized science and technology coupled with a vigorous experimental program as a means to better understand the physics and chemistry of nuclear weapons and their operations, particularly as they age. This new program provided enhanced warhead surveillance tools so that we'd have a much better chance of detecting the onset of problems in the stockpile. The goal of stockpile stewardship has been to predict the effects of aging in our warheads so that we can replace aging components before they degrade overall system reliability. The end of the Cold War provided this opportunity, and our focus was no longer on a continuous cycle of fielding new warheads to provide new military capabilities, but focused strictly on sustaining existing capabilities. And we call this life extension, the process of observing aging of individual components of warheads and replacing them before they fall. So consider this challenge. Your 1965 Ford Mustang, which you maintain as a collector's item, has been sitting in your garage for 40 years. You monitor it for such items as a clogged carburetor, corrosion in the engine block, battery discharge, and you replace parts when you deem it necessary. The key, of course, is the parts you replace it with are exactly the same parts that were built back when the automobile was built, using those 1960s ways of making things, which was good in the 1960s. Unfortunately, it's not so good right now. However, the key here is you don't get to start the engine and take it for a test drive. And the trick is to assure that if you need to do it right away, to take your spouse to the hospital in an emergency, that it would work with certainty. And that's what we have to do with our nuclear weapons life extension programs. By the mid-90s, we had embarked on an ambitious program to acquire new stockpile stewardship tools, advanced computing, high energy density physics capabilities, and enhanced surveillance capabilities. And we've made tremendous progress in acquiring and actually using these capabilities. In 2001, when this administration took office, it inherited essentially a strong science base and surveillance program, a safe and reliable but aging stockpile with serious questions about the future, and a plan, essentially an approach or a strategy for warhead life extensions. And at the time, we knew we were not getting into replacing our warheads with new designs. However, it also inherited a deteriorating or non-functioning manufacturing complex characterized by protracted underfunding, the inability to produce the necessary plutonium or uranium parts, the inability to produce and extract tritium needed for every weapon, key facilities, particularly production facilities, falling apart, and an aging workforce. So despite problems with the production infrastructure, substantial reductions in the size of the nuclear stockpile were achieved. But because we couldn't produce warheads when and if they were needed, mainly as a hedge for technical problems in the stockpile, we still had to maintain a much larger stockpile, nuclear weapons stockpile, than desired. What we needed was a functioning and responsive manufacturing complex so that we could further reduce the size of the stockpile. In recent years, we've made substantial progress, including taking the initial steps to correct some of these problems. The goal is to have a smaller nuclear weapons complex, which is more secure, more efficient, safer for the workers, safer for the environment, and more cost-effective. These are goals that I think many of us would agree with it's important to achieve. That goal was essentially laid out in a vision that we've called Complex 2030. Many of you may have heard elements of this in the past, or actually have read some of our documents on this. And to move us towards this vision, what we've done recently is we've restored tritium production and extraction at the Savannah River site in a small but modern tritium extraction facility. We've restored some key uranium operations at Y-12, but we've got a long ways to go at Y-12. We're implementing plans right now to develop an interim plutonium pit production capability of 30 to 50 pits per year at Los Alamos by 2012. That will be very difficult, but we're pushing forward on that. We are reducing the number of sites with large quantities of special nuclear materials, and we're dramatically accelerating the dismantlement of retired warheads. In 2003, we took stock of the 10 years of stockpile stewardship efforts and came to some important conclusions. The main conclusion was that as we continue to draw down the stockpile, we've become concerned that our current path may pose an unacceptable risk to maintaining high confidence in the stockpile over the long term, that current path being a life extension only path. And we think it's prudent to look before we go jump in with both feet and complete the life extension only path, that we look at other options. With every life extension we do on a weapon, we slowly move further and further away from designs that were certified with underground tests. These inevitable accumulations of small changes over the extended lives of these highly optimized and complicated systems have given rise to concerns about the reliability of weapons over time. We're talking about not the near future, but over time as we continually refurbish and perform life extensions. So while we are confident that today's stockpile is safe and reliable, it's only prudent to explore these alternate means to assure reliability over the long term. After all, we're dealing with nuclear weapons, and any error or slight uncertainty is ultimately an unacceptable risk, both from a safety standpoint and from the nation's national security as a whole from a strategic standpoint. This is the impetus for our work on the Reliable Replacement Warhead, or what's been called RRW. With RRW, we'll be able to be confident in our weapons for the long term, making them more secure, safer, and more reliable. A second major driver for RRW was the realization that after the September 11th terrorist attacks, that the security threat to our nuclear warheads had fundamentally changed. The security features in today's stockpile are commensurate with technologies available during the Cold War and with threats at that time. Major enhancements in security are not easily available through the current method of retrofits to the legacy Cold War stockpile. And so we need a way to incorporate modern security technology into the stockpile. It's the same idea of replacing your home security system from one in the 1960s from one in this century. More broadly, the RW program is examining the feasibility of providing replacement warheads for the legacy stockpile. This is a replacement warhead is a key, replacement is a key word here. This effort will allow the design of replacements that are safer and more secure, eliminate environmentally dangerous materials, and increase what we call design performance margins, or simply put, they will be over-designed to ensure they will work, thus guaranteeing long-term confidence and reliability. RW, therefore, will allow us to transform to a much more efficient and responsive, but much smaller, and we believe less costly, nuclear weapons infrastructure. We're often asked, if the stockpile is safe and reliable, why start on RW right now? Why not wait a few years when you know more? The need to start now is driven by two basic reasons. First, the introduction of the RW system provides the benefit of additional diversity in the nation's sea-based nuclear force, which is needed in case problems are discovered with that whole type of warhead. RW will replace a portion of the W-76 warhead deployed on the Trident system. That particular warhead comprises a high percentage of our planned future strategic nuclear deterrent under the Moscow Treaty. Although we've not uncovered any problems with the W-76, it is prudent to hedge against the catastrophic failure of that system by introducing a diverse warhead design into the submarine-launched ballistic missile force. Second, the RW effort has provided an opportunity to ensure the transfer of nuclear design skills from the generation that honed these skills with nuclear testing to the generation that will replace them. In 5 years, nearly all of that older generation will be either retired or will have passed away. While some would argue that the RW program undermines nonproliferation goals, we see the overall RW strategy as having a positive implications for nonproliferation. A major nonproliferation objective of the United States is to prevent rogue states and terrorist groups from acquiring weapons of mass destruction or the materials to make weapons of mass destruction on their own. U.S. nuclear modernization will not increase incentives for terrorists to acquire such weapons. Their incentives are already high and almost unrelated to nuclear capabilities. Terrorists are typically driven by hatred and ideology, not by the U.S. wanting to replace its nuclear weapons stockpile with safer, more secure warheads. RW is not likely to have an impact on rogue states either. These nations continue proliferating, operating secret nuclear programs, or both, all independent of what the U.S. does with its nuclear program. Over the past decade, we've seen very significant reductions in the numbers of U.S. nuclear weapons, reductions in the alert levels of nuclear forces, no nuclear testing or production of nuclear materials or nuclear weapons, and very little U.S. nuclear modernization. There's absolutely no evidence that these developments have caused North Korea or Iranian leaders to slow down their covert programs to acquire capabilities to produce warheads and weapons. I should add that the extension of the U.S. nuclear deterrent to NATO and other allies has been an important tool for nonproliferation. It has eliminated the need for allies to develop and field their own nuclear forces, all of which they're technically capable of doing so. It's important to keep in mind that the RW is designed to replace the current aging warheads. It's not new in the traditional arms control or military sense. It provides no new military capability. It will have the same form, the same fit, the same function as our current weapons. It will not increase the size. It will not increase the power of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In fact, actually, the power of the nuclear arsenal will decrease with our introduction of RW. Power is measured by yield. It will simply allow us to have deployed a safer, more secure design that gives us greater long-term confidence in the reliability of our stockpile rather than having to depend on old, outdated Cold War arsenal. As I said before, RW is being pursued under the firm requirement that it will not need to be tested for certification to become part of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. This reinforces our commitment to maintaining our moratorium on underground nuclear testing. On the other hand, as older weapons in the current stockpile age further, there is no guarantee that they will not need to be tested to maintain confidence in their safety and reliability. The RW will also facilitate further reductions in the U.S. nuclear stockpile. U.S. accomplishments in this area have already been substantial and have largely overlooked, in my opinion. Whole classes of nuclear weapons delivery vehicles, short-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles have been virtually eliminated. Last year, the NNSA announced the dismantlement of the last remaining W-56 nuclear warhead, and we completed dismantlements of 2 modifications on the B-61 nuclear bombs. These systems are out completely. And just last week, we announced confirmation that our rates for dismantling nuclear weapons have shot up more than 50% over the last year's dismantlement rate. That was the goal we set for ourselves, and some people doubted we could do that or ever would do that. The great news is that with 4 months left this fiscal year, we're going to continue on that safe pace and continue to accelerate dismantlements that we had been planned for the next fiscal year and move all of those forward. So my goal is to rapidly accelerate the rate of dismantlements of systems that we've already designated for retirement and make sure that those warheads will never be used again or placed back in the stockpile. Because of the Moscow Treaty signed by Presidents Bush and Putin, the number of operationally deployed strategic weapons will go from over 10,000 at the peak of the Cold War to a range of 1,700 to 2,200 by 2012. In addition, based on a decision and further direction by President Bush in 2004, the overall U.S. nuclear arsenal will be at its lowest levels since the 1950s in just 5 years. Our near-term strategy for the U.S. nuclear weapons complex includes an increased rate for dismantling warheads that are retired from the stockpile. Dismantlements ensure that our plans are not misperceived by other nations as restarting the arms race. Indeed, our commitment to a smaller stockpile is made concrete by our record of accelerated dismantlements. Moreover, the RRW will give us greater confidence in the reliability of our weapons. This increased confidence will reduce the need for large numbers of spare warheads and allow us to take the U.S. stockpile to still lower levels. The ability to reduce our stockpile even further with RRW keeps it consistent with our international obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Let me conclude by summarizing my basic message. To meet its own security needs and those of its allies, the United States will need a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent for the foreseeable future. We will achieve this with the smallest nuclear stockpile consistent with our national security commitments. 2, we see increased risk, absent nuclear testing, in assuring the long-term reliability of today's stockpile of legacy warheads left over from the Cold War. 3, the infrastructure that supports the stockpile is very old and is not sufficiently responsive to technical problems in the stockpile. That's a fact. 4, our task is to ensure that the U.S. nuclear weapons enterprise, including the weapons and supporting infrastructure, fully meet the long-term national security needs of the country. 5, our approach is to develop reliable replacement warheads for the legacy stockpile, warheads that are more reliable, more secure, and safer. 6, our goal is to transform our stockpile and modernize our infrastructure, ultimately so we can reduce the stockpile even further. Exact numbers, of course, will get classified, but it's the idea of continuing to reduce because we want essentially a nuclear deterrent that is resident not in warheads or material, but in the ability to produce something should the nation need it. And last point, and we intend to accomplish all of this with the smallest stockpile necessary without requiring underground testing. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, we have some questions. Please identify yourself, name and affiliation. Jonathan?
Yes, hi, I'm Jonathan McGallagher from the Congressional Research Service. I have a question about Phase 2A and Phase 3.
Right.
RRW is in Phase 2A, the cost and design study, and the Nuclear Weapons Council called for it to be in Phase 2A through the end of calendar 2007. But the House and Senate Armed Services Committee wanted it kept in Phase 2A through FY08. So the first question is, what will the program do between December 31st of 07 and September 30th of 08? Then the second question is, if Congress decides to keep RRW in Phase 2A through FY09, what would be the consequences for the program? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. First question deals with what happens after December 2007 when the original plan was to finish the Phase 2A work this calendar year, essentially at the very end of this year. What it turns out, Jonathan, is that it will take, we think it's going to take a fair amount of time longer than 2007 to do the work. I've testified in various committees over the past few months when I've testified before the Armed Services and the Appropriations Committees, and have described that we believe it's going to take at least 9 to 12 months in working with the United States Navy to develop what I would say the study work to put together a good cost, a good scope, and a good schedule for this project. It's a multi-year activity. The reason why it's going to take longer than we originally planned is a couple-fold. One is that we, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't something we've done in the last 20 years, so it takes a fair amount of time. Two is we want to get it right. We want to make sure that when we pull all of this data together and come together with a cost and schedule and a good definition of what it's going to take to actually do this, because we have it right. The reason, here's the logic. We want to be able to get this information together because we see this as one of the bits of information we need to decide whether or not we should proceed forward to the next phase. And actually, it's not a decision that's made solely at my level. It will essentially be a decision that, or does the administration want to propose to Congress that we get authorization to proceed to phase 6.3, which for many of you might say, well, what does that mean? That's the development engineering phase. The phase 6.3 is the phase where you actually start producing some parts that you can test bits and pieces of and figure out, make sure that the engineering is right. It's actually not building a warhead, but it's building the parts for it. Phase 2A is the study piece. So it will take longer than December of 2007 to get that work done. I don't think the work will actually be done until June of next year to get a joint cost and schedule item together till June of next year. And I'll admit it's a little bit out of phase with the congressional authorization and appropriation cycle, but we are where we are, and we're going to try to do the best we can. And of course, we're going to continue to work with the committees, the members and staff on keeping them fully enclosed in that dialogue.
Yes.
We have a microphone, actually. I'll come around to you now.
Ashley Roki with Congress Now. So a little bit delayed, maybe June of next year before you wrap up the work, but there's pretty much a bipartisan support on the Hill against moving forward with RRW at that point. So even looking ahead at 2009, how do you go back and convey a message that you have to push forward with RRW at this point?
Thank you, Ashley. I think one of the things that I would say is the 3 out of the 4 committees that authorize and appropriate for this program have gotten their information out. The one committee that has spoken out pretty strongly against that, as you probably know, is the House Appropriations Subcommittee. We continue to talk with members and the staff in that subcommittee. The other 2 committees, as House and Senate authorization subcommittees, have actually provided resources and support, but only focused on Phase 2A. They're very clear about authorization to proceed, not with actually making parts, but with actually allowing us to do the work that's necessary to figure out, is this a strategy that we want to proceed down the path on? The key is getting the right information so a decision can be made. I'll couch it in this way. Right now we're at a point in the nuclear weapons program where I'll make it personal, where I can say, let's go off and we're going to do life extensions forever for the whole stockpile. Okay? And what that does, life extensions, at least forever being the next few decades, is it locks in a few things. It locks in the fact that we're going to have a Cold War stockpile for the next few decades. And it locks in the fact that I have to personally maintain capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, materials that were designed for those Cold War stockpiles that I feel right now would be irresponsible for me to go forward with. I can explain in the following way. A number of our systems in the Cold War stockpile have conventional high explosives. And conventional high explosives are very sensitive explosives. They can be detonated with little energy input to get them started. So I worry about, we worry about the explosive falling. We worry about it getting hit. whether it's a bullet, somebody comes in and wants to shoot a gun at one of our warheads, whether it's a fire situation, there's an accident, and a warhead is involved in a fire. I prefer not to have that warhead involved in those scenarios, and I worry about conventional high explosives. However, we do have some of our warheads that have insensitive high explosives. These are explosives that you can actually put it, blowtorch to it, throw it in your fireplace, drop it off the table, whatever, and you won't have any issues with that. RW approach allows us to look at taking that Cold War stockpile and making sure we make it safer using this insensitive high explosive as part of the stockpile. So we're at that crossroads. And then when I talk to members in closed session, when I can actually talk about the design, the proposed designs that we're talking about here, I think many of them understand that distinction. But they recognize, and the important thing here is this is a replacement warhead. It's not a new warhead with a new capability. It's a new design for sure, but it's a new, safer design for an existing military capability. This is not an RNEP. This is not a micro nuke. This is not an advanced concept. This is a replacement warhead for a system that the nation has already determined that it needs in its stockpile. So it's a matter of making sure that message keeps going through.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think after June next year, it'll be easier to go back to the Hill with more information?
Yeah, by June of next year, I think it will be easier because what we will have is we'll have cost information, and cost is a factor here. We'll have cost information on what it will cost to do this. An important consideration for me, an important consideration for members of Congress that I talk to, is what comes off the table. We don't want to build up. The idea here is to reduce the size of the stockpile. It's not to increase the numbers or different types of warheads. So what we're doing, June of next year allows me to put together the financial picture, the programmatic picture, and the policy picture that will address what comes off the table. And it's just not just me. It's working closely with the Defense Department to get that done. Thank you, Ashley. I'll let you do that.
Yes.
Hans Christensen, Federation of American Scientists. I heard your explanation about the conventional explosives. Are you saying that you cannot change conventional explosives under the Stockpile Stewardship Program? That you need to go to a new program to do that? And secondly, how has the security of the weapons, as you said, changed fundamentally since 9/11? I mean, I can understand the physical security of the premises, et cetera, et cetera.
All right.
But the warheads, the design, how has that changed? And what are the security features that you need to add to these warheads that you cannot add under the Stockpile Stewardship Program?
If I forget, it sounds like 3 questions. I'll try to get them all. If I miss one, remind me. I can't tell you the details on the security features. I will say we have not, one of the constraints that we have with the life extension strategy, as I described earlier in my talk, was the fact that we are constrained to replicating the exact warhead that was built 20, 30, 40, like 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the manufacturing processes do change over time, even when we try to replicate them exactly. And we have some concerns right now in our ability to do just that. The difference between conventional high explosive and insensitive high explosives, and I'm not expert in the high explosive expert, so I do know we probably have Paul here might be an expert on this here. There's a bit of a volume difference here. Insensitive high explosive doesn't have as much energy per unit volume as a conventional high explosive. And so therefore, during the Cold War, the philosophy was pack as many warheads on top of a missile as you can, and efficiency. These warheads were designed with the greatest amount of efficiency, in other words, biggest bang for its weight and volume, because we wanted to get a lot on the top of a missile. That's not a consideration anymore. Now that we know that we're going to the lower numbers, the space and the weight question comes off the table. Now we can trade this space and weight for other things, and we trade it for 2 things. We trade it for security features that we would add to the warhead, and trade it for safety features. The security features are classified because if I told you, then they'd be quite a bit less secure because people would know since it's open session. But from a safety standpoint, let me give you an example. From what would be different? Beryllium, for example. My goal is to eliminate beryllium from the nuclear weapons stockpile. Beryllium is a metal that we've recently understand. I say recently, within the last decade or two, but it's a metal that we currently have in certain places in our stockpile. I don't want that metal in the stockpile because what we know now is that it causes problems. Some people are susceptible to a disease called berylliosis, which affects the lungs. And right now, the U.S. taxpayers are rightly compensating certain people who have this problem, but it's a liability that I don't want to preserve out for the next few decades. I want to get beryllium out of the stockpile. We have another material that requires a special solvent to be cleaned. It's the chemical term is ACN, but that solvent is very volatile. It's very dangerous. It's explosive, and I'm required to use it because that's what we used 30, 40, 50 years ago when we made this special material. And so these are the kinds of things that I can eliminate. One more example. There's a heavy metal that we use in our warheads right now. I won't tell you what it is, but it's a heavy metal, and the waste stream that was caused when we made it back in the 60s and 70s, 94% of the material was wasted in order to make one part. That is a material that I don't want to have in the waste stream anymore. I'm able to use with this RW designs what I would say is a more conventional metal that can be made a lot cheaper, a lot safer for our workforce, and a lot safer for the environment. So the key is, for me, is when I'm at this point in time when I'm looking at the infrastructure that's largely 30, 40, and 50 years old, and, whenever you have a 50-year-old house, you have to start thinking about replacing things. I need a new furnace, need a new roof, need a new fridge. What kind of refrigerator am I going to put in there? Am I going to put the exact same refrigerator, or I'm going to put in a modern refrigerator that uses less energy? But because we're tied to an LEP strategy right now, I'm forced, if I stay on that path, to stick with that energy inefficient refrigerator. So the RW strategy points that we're at right now in the country is not, yet we're building a warhead. No, what we're doing is we're spending time and energy to look at does this strategy make sense? Does it actually result in cost savings? How does it really change the nuclear weapons complex? How much smaller and more efficient can I make it? Do I need to reinvest in making this heavy metal line at one of our sites, or do I have to? Can I take that $400 million line item off the table? And that's why it's a good debate right now, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Yes, right here.
I'm John Fox from Global Security Newswire. The House at least very vehemently called for a reevaluation of weapons policy, where we are after the Cold War. And you're making an argument here for how this can make the complex more efficient and things like that, and they seem almost divorced. And I'm curious what movement there's been since that call with the people who set the policy and the people who may reevaluate the policy. And also I'm curious what your opinion is. It seems like a lot of that is out of your hands, a declaration of policy and where we should be with these levels. And I was wondering if you had a comment about just how divorced those are.
Okay, sure. I can understand why they might appear divorced, and you're absolutely right. I don't establish the policy on, yes, the country will have X number of weapons, but I do work very closely with the folks in the Defense Department and the national security arena when we look at these things, at State Department as well. My job is to make sure they understand the implications of different sizes of the stockpile, for example, and I'll just, for example, let's say we would, it's important for people that establish the requirements in the Defense Department to understand how much those requirements actually drive the NNSA budget and drive these things associated with safety and environmental impacts and the like. So we actually communicate that through the Nuclear Weapons Council. Bill Ostendorf is the acting administrator, and he communicates that very clearly to the Nuclear Weapons Council, which has the STRATCOM commander, the undersecretary for acquisition, technology, and logistics, and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that type of discussion happens at a very robust level. We recognize that the House subcommittee language wants to make sure that that information comes out in a much more open way. We believe, we've been talking to senior staff on that, and we believe that we have an approach to make sure that we try to become a bit more transparent, albeit classified transparent, if you will, to make sure they understand our plans. There's a little bit of what I would call leaning forward versus leaning back. I mean, it's shifting strategies is always a tenuous thing and a very difficult thing. Whenever you shift strategies, you have to be, in some cases, willing to let go of the strategy you're currently on and be ready to grab that strategy that potentially can be coming forward. And so in my discussions with House members in testimony and one-to-one discussions, I always talk about we want to proceed forward in kind of a methodical, slow, lockstep approach with Congress, get data, decide does it make sense to shift our strategy now or not, and why or why not. And ultimately that bleeds over into this question of the size of the stockpile, particularly as it relates to how big of a production complex do we want to reconstitute, which at this point right now is at what I would say is at a bare minimum level. It's kind of at what we call an interim level. So, yes, sir.
Hugh Gustafson, George Mason University. I noticed that in your comments you referred to the moratorium on nuclear testing. You didn't refer to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the U.S. has signed but not ratified. And there are some members of Congress who've suggested that it might be appropriate to couple approval of the RRW with ratification of the CTBT. That would send a message to other countries that might be concerned the RRW signaled a slackening of U.S. commitment to arms control. If we ratified the CTBT, that would send a message that we're committed to arms control.
Right.
So is it possible that the RRW would be coupled with ratification of the CTBT, and if not, why not?
Okay. I think to take your question head on, it's a bit premature to say we ought to hard link the two. Because at this point right now, let me explain to you where we're at in the process. We had a design competition by 2 laboratory teams last year, the end of last year. Earlier this year, we picked one of those design teams as the preferred alternative to work with the Navy to actually do the cost and schedule study to determine whether RRW is feasible from a cost and schedule standpoint. And then what we expect to see is this whole question of the size of the stockpile mature over the next, what I would say, same period of time as we're working forward on developing the cost and schedule study. That provides an opportunity for this question of size of the stockpile, questions on test ban treaty to come up and bubble up, and clearly they are. At some future point, and it won't be in the next year and a half, in my opinion, that it might make sense to take a look at your question, particularly as it relates before you actually build the first one. Because at that point, if you decide that you're going to go down to this new strategy and path, then you're making a pretty strong statement that not just about initial certification without underground testing, because that's my commitment. We won't proceed forward. I wouldn't recommend spending $1 if we think this is going to be need to be certified with an underground test. Absolutely no way. But the real question is not the first time up, it's over the long term. But only until we've completed our studies over the next few years, the design definition and cost study over the next 9 to 12 months, and done some of the initial work, do I think I would be willing, if I was in this position, to make that hard commitment, say, you know what, we ought to hard link the two. But it's clearly a topic that has come up, and but my view is it's a decision for later, not for today.
In the back.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me apologize for not being here for the entirety of your talk. I was delayed at another meeting over at OSDP A&E, so I apologize. It does take some time, as you well know. over with those guys and their charts and graphs and stuff. Especially with Dennis Evans. In any event, I have 3 questions for you, and I hope not to take up too much of your time, and 1 comment. The first question is, if we look at the modern theory, first question is on testing. If we look at the modern theory of international conflict as embodied in Bueno de Mesquita and Lalman, War and Reason, what we see there is a very convincing finding that the incidence of war declined significantly once European nations began hiring professional armies that drilled and went into maneuvers, and so could signal to other nations their interest in armies and their capabilities with armies, and the fact that they were paying attention to their military forces. And it strikes me that a moratorium on testing, it would be very similar to a moratorium on military drilling. Tests are like drilling, and to eliminate testing, it would be is very much similar to eliminating drilling, and to return to testing would be to once again demonstrate the fact that we are interested in our nuclear forces, that we are paying attention to our nuclear forces and their modernization, and that would be a demonstration to all other countries that we are interested and that we are willing to bear the burdens, economic and ecological cleanup-wise, of paying attention to and modernizing our nuclear forces. And so I don't believe that a ban on testing or a continuation of a moratorium on testing would in fact increase the probability of peace. It might well increase the probability of enemy attack on our allies, our interests, or ourselves, and I think people should consider that. I would like your comment on that. The second question is, as Bueno de Mesquita, Syverson, Smith, and Morrow demonstrate in The Logic of Political Survival, the second book on this topic, autocracies and totalitarian regimes tend to consider very strongly the damage that will be done to them in a war, to their forces and to their leadership cadres especially, when they determine the minimum probability that they need to initiate war rather than take the best peaceful settlement that is offered to them by the other side, usually a democracy. So therefore it strikes me that and I'm sorry that I wasn't here for the rest of your lecture. I only heard the last part.
Please, let's close this up.
I'll speed it up. To
No.
rely on a threat to build weapons and come back later on and hit them would be rather ineffective, as well as an assumption that we are going to build up when we see a threat rising. That sounds to me like England in the 30s. And we know what happened to them. We know why England slept. And I'm not sure I would want to rely on that rather than have a capability in being. The third question...
I think that's enough on the table right now.
All right.
Yeah.
I would want to make one comment and swift.
No, I think
okay. All right. Thank
you've
you.
made enough.
Okay. Let me get to your, probably testing was your first question. And the real point here is that I believe strongly in the current moratorium we have on testing. I believe the nation has invested a lot of money over the last number of years in purchasing and using some very significant tools, computing tools, experimental capabilities. We understand a lot more about what goes on in the material science area than you can possibly imagine. So we have great confidence in our stockpile that we have right now because we have greater insight into the actual stockpile itself. And in fact, that greater insight allows us to essentially be focusing on fixing things we know need to get fixed. In fact, we do test significant portions of our stockpile. We test them in sequences and in pieces. The last thing we don't test, of course, is finally getting to a point where we have a nuclear yield. We are not going to do that. We don't need to do that. We have the data that shows that we don't have to prove that again. We've proved it we've proved it many hundreds of times already in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, let's put it that way. Your second point was concern about having, I believe, deals with the nuclear posture review on this concept of having a capability to respond versus the actual warheads in your pocket, if you will. And we feel very strongly that this isn't a matter of getting rid of all the nuclear weapons. We're talking about significantly reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons that we have in our stockpile, and we think we can do that, and we'd like to do more of it, because in the end, the question comes up, well, how many do you need? So from my sense, we can get by with fewer nuclear weapons, and in fact, that's indeed what we are planning, and at a classified level, the numbers are fairly dramatic in the reduction. The key, of course, is that if there is a need, if there is a significant geopolitical change that comes forward that says we have to be concerned about restarting the arms race, we'll be able to proceed, we'll be able to look far enough in advance. But this isn't about giving up and going and sitting on our guard and pretending that we're going to maintain the country safe just because we think we can build something.
Bob. Right here.
Thank you. Bob Nurek, Monterey Institute. Quick question. Have you had or do you have any plans to have discussions with Russia or China about these matters? I know less about the Chinese case, but I can tell you that the Russian nuclear establishment is, first of all, more than a little curious about about the discussions here, and they're having their own debates about similar topics. So.
Certainly. Good question. We took a concerted effort in this administration to have discussions and dialogues before we actually went out with public announcements and forward with this RW concept. The response, in fact, it wasn't just Russia and China, it was with our NATO countries and other allies. We found great, what I would classify as great understanding as to what we were doing from a concept standpoint. It's this idea of not changing and not building new nuclear capability from the standpoint of new performance, but it's a standpoint of replacing and making smaller and making things safer and more secure. In fact, many of the nuclear weapon states are looking at and doing this on their own anyway. And the Russians in particular have asked us to come back and give them participate in a little bit more in-depth discussions. And the folks in the Defense Department that will engage in that know about that, and I'm not sure if they've actually had that discussion yet, but they're planning on it for sure.
Scott.
Is it on? Scott Davis, State Department. You mentioned the recent announcement of the fact that NNSA had reached the 50%
Yes.
increase in dismantlement since last year, and the fact that that's 4 months before the end of the year, so clearly you'll be well over 50% for the fiscal year.
Right.
Can you give us an idea, and you also indicated that you hope that higher rate would continue. Can you quantify that in any way? Do you expect to try to go, expecting 50% a year increase is probably too much, but is there any way to quantify that at this point?
Yeah, I think there is.
In terms of your objectives?
Sure, certainly. And it's a difficult subject because too much information ends up hitting into some of the classified numbers. But I'll describe it in this fashion. March of 2006, my organization submitted a classified report to Congress describing in detail on a weapons-by-weapons basis our plan to accelerate the dismantlement of warheads. And what we did is we had a baseline prior to March of 2006, and the philosophy then was the warhead dismantlement activity is an activity that we would use to do load leveling, essentially, at our Pantex plant. Our Pantex plant is in Amarillo, Texas, and they do all of the hands-on weapons work themselves. And so instead of hiring on large numbers of people, to have them work real hard for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and then having to let them go, that'd be a bit irresponsible from my perspective. We decided at that time to focus on doing dismantlement work and to fill in the peaks and valleys of the normal day-to-day work. That was prior to March of 2006. With this 2006 report, what we committed to was on average 25% a year increase in our dismantlement rate from our original plan. So what the idea was is not to staff up by many, many hundreds of people, but essentially to provide a dedicated dismantlement activity at the Pantex plant. And it's not just the Pantex plant. The Y-12 plant takes apart the secondaries in the warheads themselves. So, and we included the secondaries as part of that, which is the uranium portion of the warhead. And that plan had at least this 50% spike between fiscal year 2006 and 2007, and on average, a 25% increase in the baseline out well into the next decade. Because we have relooked at the way we do business at the Pantex plant, and we've upgraded our safety and bought new tools specifically for dismantlement, and these are not crescent wrenches, they're Phillips screwdriver type tools. These are special tools that allow us to take apart these warheads in a lot different fashion, in a safer and faster way. We've realized that, hey, we not only hit this 50% mark, we think we can double. Now I'm projecting a little bit to the end of September here, but if we continue at this rate, we'll have probably doubled of what we've done in 06. And what that does is it allows me to start working off the FY08 chunk of warheads and then the FY09 and start bringing everything forward. I'm glad to see that for a couple of reasons. One is, I mean, there's the obvious taking apart a nuclear warhead benefit, but there's a security piece to that, which is the idea of the further you take the special nuclear material away from its kind of warhead state. I mean, breaking it apart from the warhead is one thing, and then now I have a much smaller volume to protect, and it can protect it in a little bit different fashion. And it ends up being, and I can put more in the same spot, obviously not too close, but put more in the same spot, and it drives some efficiency in the complex itself. And then the DoD, this is where the DoD comes in, because I can create more space at the Pantex plant, they can de-inventory some of their military bases, where that forces them to not have to maintain that security posture at that military base. That's real money to the Air Force and Navy, and it's real money for us too.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for further questions, but we've heard a comprehensive view of U.S. policy on the RRW and nuclear policy more generally, as well as a very frank assessment of some difficult issues. Please, let's thank Tom for this.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just wanted to announce that outside of the table there's advanced copies from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, their July-August issue, which has a cluster on RRW, which the editors made available for today's meeting. And there's a buffet lunch just adjacent. If you exit through this door and then go through, you can come back in here and with your sandwiches.